So you mentioned that Indiana is a more favorable matchup for Notre Dame than SMU. Why?
Quarterback. I think about
Okay.
the type of quarterback that gives Notre Dame a problem compared to the type of quarterback in the end. But Mark, I'm a big believer in football that matchups matter. And it's just because one team is I may think one team is better overall as a team, but they match up better against this other team. So, for example, you're hearing a lot of, well, Texas stinks. Texas isn't very good. And I was like, no, Texas has they're a bad matchup against Georgia. They're not a real physical football team. They're athletic, but they're not a team built around just, we watched Georgia just get ran on by UMass and Georgia Tech in back-to-back weeks because they went right at them. Well, that's not how Texas runs their run game. They're off tackle, counters, misdirection. Now you're playing right into Georgia's hands, right? It's a bad matchup. It's like in those 3-4 years where Dabo just was dominating the ACC, who's the only team to give him problems in the regular season? Syracuse and Dino Babers. Like, I don't know why it was that way, but that's just the way that it was, right? Like, Pitt had that one random game where they beat them, but that's just the way that it is. It's like Hugh Freeze gave Nick Saban problems for a couple years, dominated the league, but couldn't beat Bo Wallace and Ole Miss. You know what I mean? Like, that's just how football is sometimes. It's a game of matchups. And when I look at Notre Dame and I look at what gives them a bigger concern for me, Indiana versus Notre Dame, or Indiana versus SMU compared to Notre Dame, they both run the ball well. They both have good backs. SMU has more of one good back, and Indiana's more of a two-man group. Both have really good receiving cores. Both have veteran offensive lines. Both have better defenses than people think that they have, right? And both have really good quarterbacks that run their system well. Agreed with that overall analysis?
Oh, yeah.
Well, what gives Notre Dame a bigger problem? Is it the drop back pocket quarterback or the guy that can run around and make plays, just like the kid from USC was, right? He avoided 3 sacks that Miller Moss has no chance of avoiding, and he makes plays on him, right? Curtis Rourke, as we saw against Ohio State, if he can sit back in the pocket and have time, he's going to hurt you. If he's getting pressured a lot, it can be a problem for him. Well, the pocket passer doesn't concern me as much for Notre Dame's defense as the mobile guy. Now, for other teams, that may not be the case, and they may be more worried about Indiana than they are SMU. That's really what it comes down to, is what has given Notre Dame problems this year. It's that athletic dual threat quarterback, which kind of gives everybody problems, if we're being honest, right? And we saw that with Clemson. I mean, if it's not for an early turnover and then you have the short punt and then the penalty at the end of that and Clemson jumps up on 14-0, how does that game look if they don't have those big mistakes? And we saw once that offense got going, there was really not a whole lot Clemson can do in the fourth quarter of that game to stop that SMU offense. And that's just kind of how I look at it, Mark. Like, I don't have any doubt that if that game goes to overtime, that's probably a 1 overtime game, because Clemson had already kind of turned the lights off a little bit, and we're not going to be able to turn that back on. And SMU was like, now we're rolling. So that's really it's the matchup. It's not that I think SMU's better than Indiana. It's just, how do they match up against Notre Dame?
Yeah, that fourth quarter against Clemson was mighty impressive for SMU to pull that together and get back in the game. But Clemson made 3 plays. They got a kickoff. They got 1 square in shot. And then the 56-yard kick that I certainly didn't see coming. I didn't know that kicker was capable of that.
He had some adrenaline flowing for that one, buddy. You know he did.
Absolutely. So when you see this Indiana team, what games, and I don't know if you've finished your work on Indiana because the game is still 10 days away, and we can dig in, hopefully, if we get you next week, a little deeper.
I plan to be with
your
you
initial thoughts, what games? I would think you gravitate to Ohio State because that's the team from a talent perspective that's on Notre Dame's level that you would want to see that game.
I broke that game down, but I also view that as a bit of an anomaly game. And I always try to say, like people say, well, Notre Dame's pass defense isn't really that good. Well, what makes you say that? Well, the USC game. Well, every team kind of, if you look to their worst game of the year, that you're going to think that, okay, I think Ohio State is a very mediocre football team. Well, what makes you say that? Because I watched them against Michigan.
Sure.
Well, is that it? Well, no, I watched them against Oregon too. Was that it? Yep, that's it. Oh, well, yeah, sure. You know what I mean? If the only time you ever watched Tom Brady in Super Bowl was against the Giants, you're going to think he's not that great of a quarterback. You know what I mean? So I look at that game and I evaluate that game. You look at the athletic mismatches, but I always kind of look, what are the 2-3 best games they played, and what are the couple worst games that they played, and try to evaluate all those. So right now I'm kind of working through the Nebraska game. I'm working through the Michigan State game. I'm working through the UCLA game. I'm also going to watch the Michigan and the Ohio State games and breaking them down. And I'll tell you, I like what I see so far. This is a good football team. I think the Ohio State game was just one of those games where Ohio State just had their number that day. And I just think sometimes we can overreact too much to like one game. And I'll use Ohio State example. Do we really think that if Ohio State and Florida would have played in a rematch a week after the 2006 title game, that it would have still been a blowout like that? No, it probably would have been a much more competitive game. Maybe Ohio State wins. I try not to get wrapped up in how they looked at one game, especially when it was way different than everything they did that entire year. But I do think those 2 games in a row are something you can take from that, which is that's the first time they really played really good defenses and good lines in back-to-back games. And there's a reason they struggled in those games, because, they're big on the offensive line. They're experienced, but they're not really athletic. And those 2 defensive lines gave them some problems. Now, Michigan, actually, they were working Michigan a little bit early, and then Michigan kind of found some answers and was able to shut them down and make that game more competitive. But, that's the big thing, is they're a really good football team, Mark. I don't know that they're great anywhere. They're just really well coached. They're really confident. And even though there's nowhere where I think they're elite, I don't know that there's anywhere that I think they're bad either. And there's other teams with like major holes here, major holes there. This is a really good football team, and they've taken on the personality of their head coach. They play very arrogantly, and I mean that in a compliment, because they weren't afraid of Ohio State. I mean, they went right down the field on Ohio State that first drive. It's just after a while. And also that was, I think, the second game without their starting left guard, which I think hurt them a little bit too. They struggled with some line games in there. Drew Evans had gotten hurt. I think his first start, was the Michigan game. And then Ohio State, and I think they struggled a little bit with that. They'll have more time to clean some of that up with Tyler Stevens now getting a little bit extra time. It's just one of those days where, like, that wasn't their day. It's like, I'm like, well, that's who they really are. Okay, are we going to say that about Notre Dame? Is that who they really are when they played Northern Illinois? Is that really who Notre Dame is? You had your best day. So I tried to break down a lot of the other games and say, okay, what do I see that translates against Notre Dame? What can they do to maybe give Notre Dame some problems? And what are some areas where I think Notre Dame could take advantage in ways that the rest of the league just couldn't? Because, but like, can we be honest about something too, Mark? People act like this Indiana team is a super talented team and just out-talented all these other teams in the Big Ten. No, they're talented, but they're not that talented. That's an incredibly well-coached, disciplined, confident football team that, to me, plays a little bit above their talent level this year. And I mean that as a compliment, not as a, well, they're not that talented. I mean that as like like I said this in our show, they're a bunch of really good group of 5 players. Like, it's kind of like a group of 5 all-star team that play with a group of 5 chip on their shoulder. And that's made them a really, really good football team in the Big Ten this year.
Yeah, in that Ohio State game, I don't think anyone else that we would argue that Ohio State's not decidedly better, but when your punter muffs a snap, that's a gift of a touchdown at a crucial part in the game that pretty much broke their backs.
I think that game's probably a 24-13 game, a 21-13 game if it's not for the special teams miscues. Because the reality is, say what you want about the special teams, Indiana wasn't moving the ball on Ohio State. But to Indiana's credit on their defense also didn't give up 38 points either. And I think that's what made that game look a lot more lopsided. Because, like, we're talking about this today, it's a 14-7 game at halftime, and Ohio State scored with less than a minute left to make it 14-7. It wasn't like they just came out and steamrolled them for 60 minutes, like Notre Dame did to Army. It wasn't that kind of blowout win. It was a game that was a lot more competitive than the final score would have dictated. But to your point, Ohio State was clearly still the better football team that day, because they just ate Indiana up with their defensive line and linebacker games were just eating Indiana up. And there was nothing they could do about it.